Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Whistleblower Heroes, everyday heroes and educators sharing the information that you need to know here on Revolution Radio. And I'm your host, Ella. Today, I have an educator with me, and I'm very happy to have Richard Conn with me here. Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm well, Ella. How are you?
I'm doing well. So a little background on him. Richard is the managing partners of Innovate Partners, an early stage private equity firm focusing on disruptive technology with offices in California, New York. Richard is also the managing partner of Eurasia Advisors, a leader in troubleshooting and deal making within the CIS with particular expertise in Russia and the Ukraine. He headed the Moscow Foreign Bar Association and represents major US and CIS companies on legal, business matters, and complex dispute resolution. He lectures on Russian matters at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University and on Sovereign Debt Restructuring Framework at SIPA, INET, and most recently is the keynote speaker before the United Nations General Assembly. And he's also an author, and he's the author of book The Earthbound Parent. And today we'll be discussing this book. And again, I'm very happy to have you with me, and welcome to the show, Richard.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
Okay, so is there anything you want to add to the introduction?
No, I think that covers most of it. I suspect we'll get into some other things as we talk about the book.
Yes, absolutely. So what propelled you to want to write this book?
It's a couple of major things. One, when I was in my teens, I spent a fair amount of time thinking about the Middle East issues and how to resolve those problems. I sort of was a lawyer from my youth, at least somewhere deep inside. And so I always enjoyed thinking about international dispute resolution, which ultimately is what my field is. And I was just struck at the difficulty of making headway when there is so much irrationality involved in those disputes, meaning the sort of the invoking of supernatural forces to justify each party's positions. So that was one element. And, then I also had experiences thinking through the usage of religious organizations, of sort of the power structure that comes from invoking the supernatural to justify their positions. And I felt from a very early age very uncomfortable with the type of authority that provides to groups or individuals. And so I began writing my ideas down about that when I was in my late teens.
I see. So this is kind of like, this has been a long time in the making, it sounds like.
It has. It obviously morphed in different directions at different stages. I certainly didn't think of the angle of the child rearing and the parenting aspects until much later in my life. But that's really the beginning of the book, back when I was focused more on the elements I just spoke about.
Mm-hmm. And you becoming a parent, how many kids do you have?
I have 4 children, 2 older children and 2 younger children by my second wife.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you definitely have your work cut out for you, and you've had some practice. And how are your kids how are your kids growing, and are they becoming the type of children that you were hoping they would?
Oh yeah,
with your different perspective of parenting.
I am so proud of my kids. Raising kids to me is the great joy of life, and I recommend it to everyone. I often joke that I'm responsible for the birth of at least 500 children, and probably more, by simply talking to guys or ladies on trains and planes and telling them about my experiences and persuading them to go ahead and get married, have kids. I mean, I'm only half joking. It comes up quite often, I find, particularly in the guy world, where gentlemen are concerned with the responsibilities associated with parenting, and it's fabulous. And my kids have, each one of them has turned out to be a wonderful person. And again, I don't take credit for that. Certainly the moms get a lot, and the children themselves, but they've done a great job, and they're really wonderful, ethical, positive people who are doing wonderful things in the world.
Yeah, despite religion. I wanted to start out, this is I'm going to paraphrase it slightly, a section from the beginning of your book, and you say, Religion actually plays upon our fears in its efforts to control us. Instead of encouraging us to conquer our fears, it offers illusions and deals as a substitute for confronting and overcoming them. Here within this book, I talk as if religion were something that someone is trying to impose upon us, which it is in the sense that parents and elders do this in many societies. But the fact of the matter is that religion is something that we have created ourselves and something that, in the broader sense, we impose upon ourselves. Indeed, the recognition of the fact that human beings create religions in order to assuage our own fears is the first step toward eradicating both the fears that led us to create religion and the fears that our religious doctrines and practices have subsequently imposed upon us. So that really resonated with me, just reading that. It gave me a lot of insight from the very beginning of the book, your belief system. And so that just hearing that perspective, and it's different from mine. I consider myself a jaded Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I have an open mind, so I loved kind of engaging in your book and listening to your philosophy, because I always thought that religion and that somewhere between religion and science, in the middle, that's the true answer. At least that's my perspective. So a lot of one side of my belief resonates in this book. So it's very much appreciated. And even if you're Christian, I highly suggest reading this book. There's a lot of takeaways, whether you leave with your religion still, or you're an agnostic or an atheist.
Yeah, I did write the book in a manner and a style and in a tone to appeal to everyone, whether you're a parent or not, and whether you're religious or not. Certainly, the perspectives I offer in the book are those that make sense to me, which is not to embrace a supernatural belief system, but rather to teach oneself and one's children to rely upon critical thinking. And as you said, but part of the heart of the book is a discussion of how we're all in it together, in the sense that all of us have certain fears and desires, which I discuss, that naturally do drive us towards a supernatural belief system. And I point that out in some detail in the book. One, because I think if anyone reads that, I think they'll find that it rings true, that we all do feel these things. Mm-hmm. And it just essentially explains why we are more or less programmed to want to find ways of dealing with those fears and desires that are simple. And, you know, basically I'm saying that there's nothing wrong with having these feelings and these psychological proclivities, but there are other ways to deal with it that I think are far more effective and make us better people, and actually help us to work together in a more, I guess you'd say, refined and civilized manner.
Mm-hmm. Which you touch upon quite frequently in the book. So since we have like an hour, maybe we can there's not many chapters, so maybe we can touch upon each chapter and kind of review that so people can get an idea of what the book encompasses in further detail.
That would be great. Do you want to walk me through that and give your comments and sort of at the outset of each one?
Sure. So the first chapter, I didn't know the title. I didn't write down the title, but you talk about in 1859, Darwin's scientific explanation arose, and so that kind of began a shift from maybe superstition and indoctrined religions. Is that what you believe?
Yeah. What I'm saying is basically that that prior to Darwin publishing, his book on the origin of the species, we as a species did not have essentially an alternative explanation for how we existed, how we came to exist. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really pointing out to readers that it's been a very short time period during which religion has really had a challenge in the sense of an explanation that is better than or different than the one that existed prior to that time period, which was the supernatural. It's magic. We have no explanation, so let's come up with something that answers the question we all want to have answered. Where did we come from? What's this all about? Mm-hmm. And so I do view that as a turning point. And it's also in part an explanation for why we're still at the very early stages of developing if you will, a philosophy that makes us comfortable that does not involve the supernatural. So that to me is a turning point.
You mentioned powerful religious narratives before the age of reason. And that's
right.
when, yes. Okay. And let's see. And in this chapter is when you kind of introduce us to that something that drives some of the points that drive people to religion. And so maybe we can cover some of that.
Sure. In the, as I mentioned, I think the beginning of the book is trying basically to say to people that most of us were given a myth during our youth that involved our being at the center of the universe, if you will, related to a deity who controls the universe and our world, that we're somehow special. And it's trying essentially to say that all of us sort of start from the same place, unless we are one of the few that were raised by parents who were truly, atheist or agnostic and didn't pass along any mythology. I spend a fair amount of time in the first section of the book encouraging people just to have a little bit of doubt about that myth. And I do that by starting with things that most of us would view as real, meaning our own geographic location in the universe, our own constituent elements as humans. And basically taking a step back and saying, if you look at this myth that we were all given, it doesn't really fit reality in terms of what most of us would embrace as things that are physically real. And it's not designed to dissuade someone to the point of saying, well, I therefore reject religion. It's designed more to say, look, just open your mind to the idea that maybe there's a little bit of doubt one can have about this, just based on these initial factors that we all have to, I think, admit are real. We then go on to have a discussion of other things that I feel are real, but I'm asking the reader to consider. And those are the psychological elements, which we can go through in some detail now together. But those psychological elements, once again, are presented basically to say to the reader, look, if you see in yourself these fears and desires, and you see in yourself a desire to have an answer that sort of takes care of all of those problems, that's another reason to doubt the easy answer. And so a lot of what the book is about in the first couple of chapters is just implanting what I view as a very valuable thing to hold in your life, and that is the value of doubt. I think it's very healthy to embrace uncertainty and to recognize that we as humans, have difficulty being certain about anything. And so if one can read the first couple chapters and at least come away with a conclusion, okay, I can at least see why I should have a little bit of doubt about the easy answer that I've given myself here. That's the starting point to, being able to develop answers that are perhaps more satisfying.
Yeah, and so maybe we can kind of transition. So chapter 2 is called Fears and Desires. And you quote in there, our desire for control, actually, I don't know if it was your quote, our desire for control over our lives is the natural counterpart to our fear of powerlessness. And that really resonated with me. That was a very interesting quote.
Yes, I think that is my quote. But as you know, you can run through each one, but there are a variety of fears and desires that I basically categorize and discuss. This, you mentioned one, which would be the desire for control, and and the counterpoint would be the fear of powerlessness. Basically, I match up these fears and desires. Another simple example that most readers, I think, would and listeners would agree with is the fear of death and the desire for immortality. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, would say, yes, I have a fear of death. I have some desire for immortality, or somewhere in me that, these things are lurking about. And religion it markets itself as part of the answer for that. You don't have to be fearful of death because you never die. Okay, that's one way to deal with it. As you know, I say in the book that there's another way to deal with that I think is far more effective, and that my children accepted instantly when they were afraid of death and asked me at night about it once. So there are many good ways to deal with these things that just we're now beginning to think about, because we have the ability in a free society and with the impact of Darwinism to at least consider alternatives.
Mm-hmm. And then you go into several of the fears and desires. Let me see if I can get to them. Well, of course, you mentioned fear of death, and your own child was concerned. How did you address that when the question arose, or when the concern and the fear arose?
I came up with an answer that I then discovered I was not the first to come up with. A philosopher years ago named David Hume came up with the same answer. But I'll give listeners maybe 3 seconds. What would you say to a child? The answer I gave them is, honey, it's going to be just the way it was before you were born. And they thought about it for a moment, and they were, okay.
I like it.
Yeah. And, I've had serious surgeries. We've all had brushes with death by a certain age. I find that that's a very compelling argument, and actually, in my view, is quite true. I can't prove it beyond any doubt, but I would say that for my purposes of how I make decisions, that's a very, very strong possibility, and one that I basically accept as reality.
Mm-hmm. And with this thought, in this realm that we live in, I think the solution, or the answer, I should say, it would be, or is it the answer? The comfort I would give is that we need to enjoy our life every day, what we can. I mean, I know there's a lot of horrible things in the world, and I understand that fully, but just finding something to be grateful for, enjoying everything that your senses can give you, what you eat and what you feel and what you do and what you see and hear music. And I just think that we have to enjoy our senses and the way that in our experience of this world.
I agree with you, absolutely. My philosophy, if you will, or what you want to call what's in the book, is not a Spartan philosophy by any means. Quite to the contrary, it encourages people. I mean, as you know, there's a whole section of the book that talks about what you get, if you will, if you go down the path that I'm suggesting. I think you become much more aware that if it is just us on the planet and there's no one else, what does that imply? And I think, what I argue is that it makes us all much more aware that if we want to be good people, ethical people, moral people, we have to take actions, we have to do things, we have to interact with one another well. It also speaks to how you live your life. You can live your life the way you wish, without a reward system or a punishment system. But certainly, I think the vast, vast majority of people take that as an opportunity to build their lives in a positive way. And I spend a lot of time in the book, as you know, discussing what you described yourself as your philosophy.
Mm-hmm. So people are drawn to religion because of a feeling of powerlessness, fear of being alone, insecurity, rejection, punishment, responsibility, which is interesting, meaningless, and and you ended it with God, which was interesting. And so they're hoping to have a sense of control, some guidance and direction, safety, love, forgiveness. But it does bring an accountability, I guess is what you're saying, especially in a Catholic religion, and kind of a meaning to life. And so I mean,
if you go through those, I'm basically asking the reader to look in the mirror and see which of these fears and desires fit them. And if you can see some of these things in yourself, then that at least can give you an opportunity to say to yourself, okay, I can at least see now why I might want to embrace an answer that's easy, such as the word God, whatever that means, to make me feel like I don't have to worry about these things. I don't have to be accountable for my own life because there is someone else or some other creature in the universe that is actually dictating my life. I don't have to take responsibility for myself, for my family, because I can just pray and deal with these things. And I am pointing out, in the book that I don't view that as healthy. I do not view that as positive. I think there's a far more positive way to go that involves embracing responsibility. Certainly as parents, we should be doing that.
But even scientifically, I believe it's kind of been proven. We know everything in the universe is energy. So if you're putting this energy out, like a prayer or an affirmation, on some level, it seems like it will bring it to you. Maybe it's just the concentration or the effort or the focus, but it does seem like it comes to you. Not all the time, of course, but in various degrees. So I don't know. I'm wondering if the power of prayer is the energy we put out, and it attracts on some level, because quantum mechanics is a fascinating field, and that's there's an aspect in quantum mechanics that kind of indicates to that belief. So do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I do, Ella. First, I don't try to persuade people to abandon their religious beliefs. The book gives people some ideas about it, and certainly it talks to those who might be open to considering alternative ways of going. But look, if someone has a self-narrative that works for them, that makes them happy in their life, I don't want to rain on their parade.
Right.
And the book, I think, is respectful in that respect towards people. On the other hand, I also am open to whatever new scientific concepts are developed over time. And certainly, if in 1,000 years there is some evidence of some life form on the other side of the universe that somehow is impacting us, I'd be fascinated if I still had a consciousness to pay attention to that. But as to your specific question about energy, look, we do of course have electricity as part of our being. We're biological, electrical creatures, and I certainly do not discount the possibility that our electrical interactions have some effect on one another. I think it's a big step to go from there to having that have anything to do with what people would describe as a supernatural deity, or a communication device for a supernatural deity. I would ask for there to be some evidence of that before I would accept something that is, in my view, very difficult to jump to. But at the same time, the way I interpret what you're saying and is something very common, Ella. I think people want to feel, this gets to control. They want to feel that they have some ability to control their environment and their interactions. And it's a hard thing to accept that, we're just here on the planet, and that thinking good thoughts will not necessarily save somebody who's trapped in a cave on the other side of the world. Right. What's going to save them is if people get up, come up with ideas, and go help. And that, and so I think when people describe themselves to me as spiritual, or or wanting to have an effect on folks by their prayers, what I hear in that is good stuff. What I hear.
Uh-oh. Did we lose you? Richard,
I want to help, and I want to be part of that. What I and to my friends whom I talk to and encourage to do things, I encourage them to get up and do some stuff. Don't spend too much time in your group setting talking about how good we all are, or praying, or whatever. Talk about some positive things you can do in your community, that you can do in your world, that demonstrates that you're good. I think the instinct that we all have to do positive things is wonderful. And I think it's been expressed in part by the things you're describing, prayer, etc. But I think there are other ways to channel that are far more effective and that can also give you great feelings.
Yeah, I might want to debate you a little bit on this intrinsic goodness that you believe humans have. I think a lot of things are genetic, a lot of characteristics in humanity, but we'll leave the argument aside about nature, about mothers who naturally, like mammals, how they take care of their infants. But we'll put that aside, because I have been a foster parent, and many people know this, and I have gotten children who were basically wild, who were living like together in a shed. They had very little parenting, and they are not naturally, they had no desire to do good. They're in survival mode. They are trying to get food. They will steal. They'll lie. They do all kinds of things because they've got to take care of themselves. And it's a real battle to get them out of that mindset at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. And I didn't see a lot of desire to do good in that situation when children are fending them for themselves without any parental guidance.
Well, let me respond because you're first. Let me talk on the broader level because you're talking
Sure.
about a specific situation, and which I will come to. Look, we could have a long discussion about the nature of man, sort of Locke versus Hobbes, and these types
Right.
of.
Mm-hmm.
I would come at it from a different angle, and I do touch on this in the book that um, I think there's a winning argument to be made that simply the natural selection process that
Mm-hmm.
over time makes people taller and more attractive simply because mating moves people in those directions and also does that in the
Pulling
animal
the stronger
kingdom.
genetics, yeah, the stronger
Right.
gene out of each, yeah.
Correct. If one accepts the scientific evidence of how natural selection works, and I think the evidence for that is overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming. And if people listening haven't looked at it, just Google it, go online, watch some videos on it, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
If you buy into that basic concept, to me, it's very natural and understandable why over time people become better parents, become better people, become better in a variety of ways, simply because that is how genetic selection operates in terms of picking the mate. You could have picked a guy to have children with that loves to, uh, torture little rabbits, but you probably didn't because that was not a characteristic that you found attractive, and so you picked other characteristics that were better. And that process goes on every night in the bars throughout the world, and it goes through on the process online now, where people are selecting based on characteristics they want in mothers and fathers to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that over time, and I'm talking now about long periods of time, it's very understandable and I think correct that we become better in the sense of natural selection. Now, that doesn't mean that natural selection leads us all to be absolute, so to speak, angels. And forgive me for using that term.
Right.
But, I think most women would probably say, I don't want an absolute Boy Scout. I want a guy who can also take care of me and defend my family. And so those characteristics are bred, if you will, over the course of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years
Mm-hmm.
into our gene pools. So turning then to your point, though, I certainly am not suggesting that there are not people who are one outliers, or that we have reached a stage of civilization where all the negative qualities have been bred out of us, or that we ever will reach that state of nirvana. And I'm also not suggesting that in individual cases, someone who's born in a perfectly normal state cannot be scarred by traumatic experiences. At least what I've understood about how the brain functions, at least as best we know now, there is actual scarring that takes place, some wiring that changes if you have traumatic experiences in your youth.
Absolutely.
And you're hardwired with that. So I think there can be real damage to people, but it's beyond my level of expertise to know whether any parent, no matter how good they are, can overcome that. And my experience from the damaged people I've known in my life, it's extremely difficult to rewire.
It really is. I do that. I still do it because I've adopted some of these children, and it is hard. There's the genetic, there's the nature of their characteristics, and there's the nurture. And most of them had some kind of parental figure around, not necessarily parenting that was abusive or on drugs, and it is very hard to change it. It takes a lot of consistency. It's like one thing they learned may take um, 50 times repeating the opposite, trying to steer them in the consequences too, natural consequences or otherwise, just consequences in general can change a person's behavior and actions, just like any parent. But you're right, the trauma makes it intrinsically just more difficult to do. And there was another point I wanted to make, and I forgot what it was. But natural selection. There's one thing that I've noticed too with people. They may in their mind say, I want a person who's strong and a person who can protect me on some primitive level, but I think people are drawn to their mother or father figures, and usually the one that they had the problems with, because no family is perfect. And so they're almost reliving their own childhood with that particular, just subconsciously, I think people are drawn to the type of parents they had. And it's not necessarily a conscious decision.
I agree with that. I don't think it is. I mean, there's a lot of literature now on how people pick mates and stuff, but I think most of us would agree that we're picking mates that have qualities that we want somehow, whether they're subconscious or not. And most women, I would think, are at least somewhere in the back of their minds thinking of their mate as a potential father, for a child, and how they're going to behave and how they're going to raise a child. And men obviously think, we think the same thing with the women we choose.
Yeah. And more physical, I think men definitely go initially for what they find physically attractive, and then, I mean, at least, in generally speaking, it seems that way. But
I'm not that way at all. No, never.
Yeah. Okay.
No,
well, you're very evolved.
No, that was a joke, Ella.
Oh, okay. You could be an outlier. Who knows?
Both of my wives were, one was and one is a very, very beautiful woman. And yes, I'm as superficial in that way as most males.
Okay. Here's a question before I forget it. At any point in your life, did you ever almost decide to think, did you ever have a doubt, maybe there is something supernatural, maybe there is a God?
When I was very young, I was raised Presbyterian, and so I struggled with this when I was in my, I don't know, probably from 8 to 12 sort of time frame, ages. And I remember debating with the minister different concepts back at that stage. And I wouldn't say I ever bought into it, but there was a stage very early on where I had in my mind making a deal, if you will, with the supernatural to achieve something. Some thoughts like that are still, I still have memories of. And I think it took a while for that to totally dissipate, because you need to be very, very confident about your view of the universe and of yourself, not to want to, totally burn your bridges, or to be willing to burn your bridges.
And if you were to choose, just from an objective, not necessarily scientific, from an objective analytical sense, a religion or maybe a philosophy, which one would you choose? Would it be Buddhism, or that you had a natural preference for, that, or that you felt that resonated with you, even if you're not a religious person? I can't find the exact words, but you understand what I'm saying.
I think for the word affinity, right?
Yes, some kind of affinity for.
I don't view Buddhism as a religion the way I define religion, because I think, or a philosophy. I find Buddhist philosophy very attractive. There are elements of that I guess I do feel are part of how I think of ourselves and of the universe. And I encourage people to read some Buddhist philosophy, because I think it's very much about how we treat one another and how we live our lives. And they don't, as I understand it, and I think most I've spoken to agree with me on this, it does not in any way involve a supernatural entity. And that's the part of the picture that I define as religious. And it's that part that I'm focusing on in the book that I feel can be detrimental and harmful both to children and to society. And it is not so much the cultural elements that, the types of foods one has, or the dances we do, or the basic, concept of where we're all from, meaning geographically. Those things I do not view as harmful as the supernatural. So Buddhism to me is really a very, very positive philosophy that I think people can learn a lot from.
Agreed. And maybe we can talk about before we get to the actual parenting advice, which is good regardless if you are Christian, non-Christian, Muslim, whatever it is that you choose to believe. I'd like to touch upon that, because those are some really great tips for parenting. Let's talk about, you made so many references to people, and especially Freud. I mean, the entire one of the chapters touches upon or discusses Freud and his disagreement with religion. So can we go there and talk a little bit about Freud and his beliefs that seem to you identified with, because you referred to him so many times in that particular chapter, or referenced him?
Yes, I do. First let me say, that I believe that people should make decisions for themselves and look at various authorities. I have a big section in the book on texts, which talks about the idea that just because something is written down doesn't mean it's right. And that's the fact that you have an old book that says something doesn't mean that the argument in that book makes any sense at all. And the same can be said in my quoting anybody in the book, Freud or any other philosopher. And as you know, I do include in the book references to a variety of philosophers that I think are helpful for the readers. But ultimately, we all have to make our own decision of whether we think the reasoning is what's persuasive. And in the context of Freud and some of the other psychiatrists I mentioned, I view it as important for readers to recognize that there are real authorities from our past that have said things that are very similar to what I've said. We have a world filled with what I'll call religious propaganda, supernatural propaganda. But there's very little along the lines of what I've written or what some of these other philosophers or educators have written. And Freud is certainly a well-known name, and so I use some of his writings, but there are plenty of others as well that just are not well-known. What Freud is basically saying is that religion is nonsense, that the supernatural belief system is nonsense, and he does it in a much more direct and uncompromising way than I do. My view of it is to think of us as all essentially suffering from the same psychological maladies that I've discussed earlier, the fears and desires. And so I don't really blame people for embracing religion. People like, I think, Richard Dawkins and certainly Freud are just harsher in saying, come on, this is childish stuff. We all know there's no father figure in the sky. And he compartmentalizes that very well and indicates what it comes from. And so it is a way that I'm trying to bolster the points I'm making by saying I'm not the first one who's thought of it.
Okay. Let me see. I kind of want to go in order here. Okay, we talked about what you can gain out of living your life without religion, which is interesting. You mentioned morality, I think integrity, and the freedom basically to become who you want to be or explore who you really are without the fear of being punished. So that was really interesting. But one thing, and you made references to the Matrix, which I found interesting as well. Can you touch upon that and expound upon the reference to the Matrix and why our life is like the Matrix?
Yeah, I touched on this early in the book when I also refer to Plato's cave, which is the concept of, Plato's cave basically was Plato's way of saying that what we all see is basically a reflection of reality, not actually reality itself.
Like a projection. Mm-hmm.
A projection. You're right. We're in a cave. We're chained, and what we see up against the wall is a reflection of the fire, and we don't even know that there's a world outside of the cave. That's quite different. And The Matrix has the same concept to it. When that movie has a scene where you have a choice of taking a pill and seeing reality, or of choosing to take a different color pill and remaining essentially in the illusory world. Mm-hmm. In the illusory world that we were exposed to initially. And what I'm saying to people is, if you read the book, it's really very difficult to counter the arguments in the book because they are so reality-based. There is a decision you're making in reading it that you're willing to at least consider some of these alternative possibilities. And once you start considering them, I think there is a waterfall effect where you start to look at things a little bit differently. And one way I describe that is you start to accept doubt as part of life, accepting that maybe these religious supernatural ideas are not true. Here are 10 reasons why they may not be. And the benefit to me in that is at least those who are highly religious might hold enough doubt in their minds that perhaps they won't kill one another or others who do not share their views based on those religious views, even if they continue to want to have the self-narrative that they're related to some supernatural being, that doubt starts to creep in. So that's what I'm referring to in terms of the taking of the pill in the Matrix.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that was interesting to me, because while I was reading, I'm like, what about Stephen Hawking? In his last days, he finally, and he was one of the greatest scientific minds there is, he said that he had a feeling, or his, not a feeling, he didn't refer to it that way. He believed that there was a God and that we were thought into existence. And then I thought, and I might be wrong, that you said something that you do, however, view the, maybe I wrote it down wrong, the existence of a supernatural entity with a conscience mind that controls the universe as a possibility. Wouldn't that be labeled as God? Richard? Did I lose him?
No, I'm sorry. That was God interfering for a moment. I would answer that question without a yes or no, because I don't want it to be misquoted. And I always fear that Einstein was misquoted a couple times, or I should say taken out of context, and I think Hawkins was too. Let me be very clear. From a perspective of logic, one cannot prove a negative, right? I cannot sit here and say to you that I can prove to you that a billion light years away, there is not a teapot circling a planet with a rabbit sitting on its, on the top of it, who is the master of the universe. I cannot prove to you that that is not the case. However, in our daily lives, we all accept things as real or as true for which we do not have 100% proof. Even the concept of the sun rising tomorrow on a certain side of the east rather than the west is something for which we have a massive amount of data and theory, and which most of us would accept as real. But can one absolutely prove that it can never change under any possible circumstances? No. And so I'm only saying in the book that I recognize it from a scientific perspective. One must always recognize that there is a theoretical possibility of virtually anything. But to me, that's a meaningless place to end up, because from the perspective of my living my life or any other person making decisions and doing things, we typically would say, well, if I've got a lot of evidence for something or a lack of evidence for something, that's sufficient. So the example would be if you hear a horse clopping down the street in the middle of London in the 1800s, or I should say the noise of something clopping down the street, you might make the assumption that there's a horse coming. But you certainly could say, if someone asked you, could it be something else? You could say, yeah, it could be a unicorn. There is no proof that there are unicorns in existence, but I can't disprove it. I certainly can't disprove that he's on a street of London. But in other words, we have to use common sense. And so from a common sense perspective, my answer to your question would be, no, I don't think that that's a rational thing for anybody to hold and to build their life around. And that's really what I'm saying in the book.
I see. Okay, so we have like less than 15 minutes. So I'd like to get into your general parenting tips, which are great tips, again, whether you value religion or you don't. So can we go into that? Because like I said, I think your tips are great and fantastic. And if we have any parents out there, maybe you can take these into consideration.
Great. I'd be glad to do that. Yeah, you're absolutely right that much of the book is written for people who are parents who want to raise their children with religion or not. And so there are many aspects of parenting that I think are absolutely critical. And obviously, many of them are things that are obvious, such as show your children love, pay attention to them, spend time with them. But there's an aspect of the book that I guess you would say is also quite controversial. And that is that I think we as parents need to think for ourselves and decide how best to bring up our children. And that does not apply just to this self-narrative of our place in the universe and how we get ethics and how we behave. It also pertains to the cultural patterns that are in the society we're living in. And the example that I speak a lot about is in the book is the proclivity of parents to simply surrender their child to the internet, to television, to all the videos, all these different things. And what I'm basically saying to parents is, look, think about it. And I'm not telling them what to do, but I'm saying I, as a parent, had to make a decision about whether it was in my child's best interest to be raised in front of a television for 6 hours a day, which is close to the average now. And maybe the way I can get through to parents who might be listening is by an analogy or an example I give in the book. If you were walking down the street and a stranger came up to you, a gentleman, and said, "Hey, do you mind if I talk to your daughter for a second or two?" You might say, "Sure." How would you react, though, if that person said, do you mind if I talk to her for half an hour just over there around the corner, one-on-one? You would probably run pretty fast and call the police.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But what do we do as parents? We typically will turn on a television set or turn on any other device that allows interaction with third parties. And we're not in a position to curate, to control what is said to our children in that context, what commercials come on, even if we feel we have some confidence in the TV show that they're watching. So there's a huge amount of information and exposure that our child is getting that's essentially coming from a stranger. Now, of course, if you're watching the Disney Channel, you might feel more confidence about that. But I think we're all a little bit we don't pay attention to the point that there are all these influences that we may not have for our child. And that's one particular aspect. The second is that by teaching our child to engage in these passive activities, such as watching or being in videos and these
cell phones, trust me, a lot of cell phones.
or cell phones, we're depriving them of real life opportunities. The way I raised my kids, particularly my second litter of children, as I call them, was by exposing them to real things. My two girls are ballet dancers. They speak 3 languages fluently because we had a nanny who spoke Mandarin to them. And my second wife is a Russian speaker. I am too. We, did all that stuff. And we have other languages. We have music. We have sports. In short, and then, as you know, there's also chess. That's a big part of my life.
I saw that. Yes.
Have chess.
Teaching people that's critical thinking and how to strategize.
Right. And I'm not saying to parents that this is the only way. I give dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of things, the menus that we can give our children to, that we can choose from. But we as parents, we set the course for our kids. And so if we do not expose them to active lives, to meaningful activities, to learning things, and to enjoying that experience, believe me, it's all play. Children only want to play. So I never give them anything that is not play, including languages. But you can basically help your child develop an interactive mode with the world rather than this passive virtual in a virtual mode that I think our society is moving towards. And you, as a parent, if you're listening to this, you have the ability to change that for your child. And you just have to decide to do it. And I give a lot of tangible examples of how you can do that.
One thing I like, one of the first things you say, and maybe I missed you saying it, create a parenting plan with your spouse. I like that idea. Because the one thing you realize when you're married and you bring children into your home, all of a sudden you realize your differences. That's when the conflict began, at least in my own home and with other people, at least between my husband and I, who had a very sweet, easy, innocent kind of relationship. All of a sudden you put kids in the mix and we had very strong opinions and very different beliefs on how to raise kids. That was a really interesting dynamic to see. So I like the idea of creating a parenting plan.
Yeah, I think it's worth having the discussion with your spouse about that. And and so, yeah, in the book, by the way, I should mention the book's entitled "The Earthbound Parent: How and Why to Raise Your Little Angels Without Religion." By the way, I should mention I don't keep any money from it. It all goes to a not-for-profit. But I do want people to read it, so I guess I should at least mention what the name is once in a while in the broadcast.
Well, we're going to reiterate it too at the end because I want people to know where to buy it and your website and all that as well.
Super. But I think parents naturally care so much. They love their kids. We all do. And so we tend to fight over the littlest thing because we think it matters to the child. If you can have some period of time where you try to talk about what your basic game plan is, what you're trying to do with your child, I do give a lot of ideas of how to approach that, how to do it, what some of the things are you may want to decide. And you may not agree on everything, but to the extent you can agree on a lot of it, it's a great start. And to the extent you disagree, at least you can identify those things and figure out how you're going to handle that so as not to be fighting all the time. But, it's natural to experience what you went through, Ella, in terms of massive disagreements because you care so deeply about every little thing for your child.
Yeah, especially when you have the new parent syndrome. You're micromanaging it. But see, we had instantly 4 kids because we were foster parents and we'd get groups and sibling groups, and so it was just really interesting. And you pain over everything, and then also when you're dealing with kids who have all this trauma, it becomes more intricate as well. But you do learn to compromise, that's for sure. And also situations arise that you don't think about, and so you have to kind of revisit your plan, I guess. I think that's the best way to say it. Maybe we had like meetings once a month, and we'd have family meetings too, and I found that to be extremely helpful. So I want to suggest that to people who maybe go over what's working in the family and in the household, what's not, how to come to compromise, and how to come up with solutions, and kind of create initiatives or motivations and consequences, basically. So I really enjoy doing that. That seemed to work really well, the family meetings.
Yeah, those are great ideas. Family meetings, I think, are very, very positive. And as we discussed, these ideas, whether in the book or the one you're offering, apply equally well in highly religious families. You still want to be very conscious of how you're teaching your children, how you're raising them, in aspects other than their place in the universe. There are a lot of other decisions to make as well, and it's good for parents to at least be aware that they have decisions to make in that regard.
And you mentioned in your book that basically your kids are learning from watching you, and that's so true. So we kind of have to walk the walk and talk the talk. And even if you don't talk the talk, you got to walk the walk because that's what they're watching.
Yes, and this is a part of the book that many parents are going to find difficult, but I think it's absolutely true. If you really love your kids, consider what you're willing to sacrifice in order to provide a good example to your child. If you want your child not to drink, are you going to sit around drinking beer all night, in front of your child?
Right.
If you want but it gets tougher. If you want your child not to watch TV at all, are you going to watch TV? If you want your child instead to watch certain movies on the internet that you select, which is what we do, are you going to be willing to do that yourself? Because I can assure you, let me put it this way. If I eat ice cream at night, my kids notice that, all right? It's really hard to tell them not to eat ice cream.
You can be sneaking down there and they hear you.
They know, they spy, they do it all. So I think really what a lot of the book is saying in the parenting section is just your point. We do parent by example. So think about how you're going to behave in your family and set the example you want. That's where you really see if you love your kids enough to
make your own sacrifices, as you said. Yeah, we're kind of a TV-less home, and I think that is great. It gets kids
not
outside.
Ones you want your children to emulate.
Yeah, I mean, I do watch the news because I'm involved with politics. I work with human rights groups and otherwise, and I I have to be in the know when I'm talking to the whistleblowers and the like, and so I do watch politics, and I do watch a little humorous. I think a little humor is good to watch. We'll watch funny family videos or animals doing funny things and lighthearted things like that, as well as being tuned into the world a little bit, what's going on in the world.
Well, we do that too. Obviously, my work, as you know, is in part U.S.-Russian relations.
Right. Yeah.
Trying to find ways for people to get along and to solve problems, and so the children certainly get a flavor for that, and we also have them learning about it with online types of activities that we show them. Now, obviously, people are probably thinking in the back of their minds, okay, well, what do you do when they're 15 or 16? Of course, there is a point at which you're not going to have, if you will, control over what your child sees. So I'm referring to the early years, but
yes,
believe me, if you teach your children well in the early years, they are formed and they have their own ideas at that stage of what they think is good to eat and good to watch and things to do and how they interact in the world.
And Plain, I love that you mentioned music. I think that, there we go. Can you please give your links and where to buy your book?
Yes, you can buy it. The easiest way is on Amazon. It's, again, The Earthbound Parent, How and Why to Raise Your Little Angels Without Religion. Find it well. Sure. Please tell your friends on social media about it. Join the website, Earthbound Parent, and follow me on Twitter, which is Richard Conn. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this conversation, and you take care, and hopefully we'll speak soon. Everyone take care. Don't forget to donate to freedomslips.com. We really appreciate it.